Hello everyone on the channel. I've been writing this account for 3 weeks. Not because it's long or complicated, but because reliving this experience still gives me chills. This happened about 2 years ago when I was a sales representative and spent more time on the road than at home. This story has never left my mind, and maybe sharing it here will help me finally move on. It was a typical night in mid-October. I, Andrew Miller, was driving alone toward Denver, Colorado, after a week full of meetings in Omaha, Nebraska. The road was long and deserted, cutting through endless cornfields under the dark sky. I've always enjoyed driving at night when the roads are quieter and everything feels at peace. It was past midnight when I entered an especially isolated stretch of road. There wasn't another car in sight, neither ahead nor behind. It was just me, the hum of the engine, and the straight road ahead. A light fog began to form, something I didn't think much of at first. It's common in rural areas during the early hours, but as the minutes passed, the fog grew thicker, almost unnatural, as if it had a will of its own. My high beams barely pierced through the fog. Everything around me seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The sense of calm I usually felt during these nighttime drives vanished. The road felt heavy, oppressive. I turned on the radio to break the silence, but the signal was full of static, and the songs were barely audible. And then I heard it. Whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the cornfields, but it wasn't. These were voices. Low, indistinct, but definitely human. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once. My chest tightened as I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. When I looked in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. For a brief moment, I was sure I saw something, or someone, moving in the fog, at a distance impossible to gauge. A tall, slender shadow stood still in the middle of the road. I blinked, turned to look again, but it was gone. My mind told me to keep driving, but my entire body was frozen with fear. The silence on the road became deafening, except for the whispers that grew louder, as if they were closing in. Then suddenly something hit the roof of the car. It was as if a rock or a branch had fallen from the sky, but there were no trees nearby, just the empty road and the endless cornfields. I stepped on the gas. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest, and the whispers were now inside my head, impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a peaceful drive. Something was following me on that road, something I couldn't understand, but it seemed determined to make me stop. And then I saw it again, right ahead of me, standing in the middle of the road. A figure, tall, thin, with arms that seemed unnaturally long. It had no face, or, if it did, it was obscured by the fog. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just a few meters away from the figure. But when I looked again, it was gone. There was nothing there. Just the oppressive emptiness of the road and the fog surrounding me. I knew I needed to get out of there, but I had no idea what else awaited me down that road. After that terrifying experience on the silent road, Mark felt like something had fundamentally changed within him. The following days were consumed by a mix of paranoia and an uncontrollable curiosity. He couldn't shake the image of the man's eyes, the motionless shadow, and the distant laughter that seemed to echo endlessly in his head. Mark decided he had to go back. It might have been a terrible idea, but he knew he couldn't move on without trying to understand what had happened that night. He reviewed the map of the area and devised a plan. He'd return to the road during daylight, armed with a powerful flashlight, a camera, and his trusty baseball bat. On Saturday morning, he drove to the road's entrance. Daylight didn't make the place any less eerie. The trees were still dense, casting a perpetual shadow over the cracked asphalt. Mark parked his car in a small pull-off and began to walk. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the silence around him was deafening. A few meters in, he spotted the tire marks from his previous visit and the remnants of the beer can he had discarded days ago. But something else was there. A small notebook with a dirty, torn cover lay right in the middle of the road. He didn't remember leaving it there. Reluctantly, Mark picked up the notebook. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages, each one covered in scribbled words and grotesque drawings. The sentences seemed like desperate warnings. They are always here. Don't leave the car. What you saw, they saw too. A chill ran down Mark's spine. The drawings depicted human-like figures with elongated faces and hollow eyes, standing in the road, surrounding vehicles. On one page, there was a sketch that felt disturbingly familiar. His car, with a figure standing exactly where he had seen the man that night. A sound broke the silence behind him like a twig snapping. He spun around, gripping the baseball bat tightly. Nothing. Just the empty road. The wind began to pick up, but there was no sound of rustling leaves, only the same oppressive silence. Suddenly, a familiar smell hit him. The same metallic odor he had sensed in the car that night. Mark scanned his surroundings and his flashlight began to flicker for no apparent reason. At the far end of the road, the shadow reappeared, only this time it was much closer. The figure moved slowly, but Mark didn't wait to see what would happen. He dropped the notebook, turned, and sprinted back to his car. The trees seemed to close in around him, branches snapping as though something was moving quickly through the woods. When he finally reached his car, he jumped in and locked the doors with trembling hands. As he started the engine, the car radio, off just moments ago, turned on by itself. A raspy, almost inaudible voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." Mark floored the accelerator, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, but eventually he reached the exit. As he merged onto a main highway, the absolute silence was replaced by the familiar sounds of civilization, but the terror inside him lingered. Back home, Mark tried to forget, but things were never the same. Lights would flicker at night, and he swore he could hear footsteps in the hallway. The notebook, which he had left on the road, mysteriously appeared on his desk days later, open to the page that read, "What you saw, they saw too." Mark sold his car and moved to another state, but nothing seemed to rid him of the feeling that he was being watched. The silent road was never visited again, but for Mark, what he encountered there would follow him forever. 2 months ago, my friend Tyler invited me to go camping in Whistler Forest, Washington. Tyler had always been fascinated by outdoor adventures, and even though it wasn't really my thing, I decided to accept. It was a chance to disconnect from routine and enjoy nature. We arrived on Friday afternoon, and the forest was even more impressive than I had imagined. Towering trees formed a natural canopy, blocking out most of the sunlight. The trail to our campsite was well marked, but the place had a dense, heavy silence that was almost intimidating. After about an hour of hiking, we found a clearing near a stream. It was the perfect spot to set up our tents and build a fire. While we were setting up camp, Tyler, excited as always, brought up stories about people disappearing and urban legends surrounding the forest. I pretended not to care, but deep down, those stories unsettled me. Around late afternoon, Tyler suggested exploring more of the trail before it got dark, but I decided to stay behind and organize our gear. He went off alone, promising not to take too long. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and the forest's silence was almost deafening. When Tyler returned, it was already dark. He seemed excited and told me he'd found an abandoned cabin further up the trail. According to him, it was in ruins, but there were furniture and objects inside, as if someone had been living there recently. I suggested we check it out in the morning, but he insisted on going at night, saying it would be more thrilling. I grabbed my flashlight and we headed down the trail. Tyler led the way while I illuminated our path. The forest felt more alive at night, but not in a comforting way. There was something in the air, a sense that we weren't alone. The sound of leaves and twigs snapping seemed to come from all directions, as if something or someone was following us. After about 15 minutes, we reached the cabin. It was an old structure with rotting wooden planks and shattered windows. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Tyler entered first, while I hesitated outside. When I finally mustered the courage to go in, I was hit by a strong smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. Inside, there was an old table covered in yellowed papers, a torn-up sofa in the corner, and strange marks on the walls like deep scratches. Tyler found a dusty notebook on the table and started flipping through it. The pages were filled with drawings and incoherent notes, as if someone had written them in a state of desperation. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise outside, like something had fallen or been thrown against the cabin. Tyler looked at me, and for the first time that night I saw fear in his eyes. We ran toward the door, but before we could open it, another sound came from inside, this time from upstairs. My flashlight started flickering, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. Tyler grabbed my arm and whispered, "I think someone's here." And that's when we heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps above us coming down the stairs. The footsteps descending the cabin stairs were slow and deliberate, almost as if whoever or whatever it was wanted us to know it was coming. Tyler's grip on my arm was so tight I could barely move. My flashlight kept flickering, its intermittent beams of light only making the atmosphere more terrifying. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, barely able to contain my panic. He nodded, and together we bolted for the cabin door. But when we pushed it, we realized it was jammed or blocked by something. Tyler began pounding on the wood, shouting for it to open, while I desperately tried to keep the flashlight steady to illuminate the room. It wasn't working. The footsteps drew closer. I could hear the creaking of the wooden stairs under the weight of whatever was approaching. My heart was pounding, every second stretching into an eternity. When I finally glanced at the stairs, I froze. A silhouette stood on the middle step, completely still, just watching us. "Who's there?" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't respond. Then, slowly, it began descending again, revealing faint traces of a face shrouded in shadow. There was something deeply wrong about how it moved, almost inhuman. Without hesitation, Tyler grabbed a piece of wood from the floor, wielding it like a makeshift weapon. "Stay away from us!" he shouted, his voice trembling with fear. The figure stopped on the last step, fully visible now. It was a tall man in tattered, dirt-stained clothes. His face was marked with deep scars, and his eyes, they were utterly void, as though there was no life behind them. He didn't say a word. He simply pointed at the notebook in Tyler's hand. Realizing what the man wanted, Tyler threw the notebook onto the floor, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us, as if waiting for something. Then a deafening noise filled the cabin, a scream, but twisted and inhuman. That was all the motivation we needed. Together, we slammed against the door with all our strength, breaking it open and sprinting down the trail. We didn't look back, only focused on running as fast as we could, but behind us we could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth, pursuing us. When we finally reached our campsite, the dying embers of the fire barely lit the clearing. We grabbed our belongings hastily, stuffing everything into our backpacks. But as I worked, I noticed Tyler had gone still, his eyes fixed on the trees. "He's there," he whispered. I followed his gaze and saw the silhouette again, standing among the trees, unmoving, just watching us. This time, however, it didn't follow as we bolted down the trail toward our car. Once inside the vehicle, Tyler floored the gas pedal, and we sped away without looking back. The silence in the car was suffocating. Neither of us wanted to talk about what had just happened, at least not yet. When we finally got home, Tyler swore he would never set foot in Whistler Forest again. I didn't need convincing. A few days later, Tyler called me to say he had burned the notebook he had brought back from the cabin. He didn't explain why, but there was something in his voice, an edge of fear, that told me he didn't want to take any chances with whatever had been inside that cabin. Even now, when I think of Whistler Forest, a chill runs down my spine. I don't know who or what that man was, but I'm certain of one thing. He was waiting for us, and somehow we barely escaped. Hello everyone on the channel. I've been replaying this story in my head for days, and just thinking about it still gives me chills. It was an ordinary night, the kind that starts without any sign of what's to come. I had left work a bit later than usual and decided to stop at a 24-hour service station to refuel and grab something to eat before heading home. The road was deserted. That familiar feeling of solitude on an open road usually didn't bother me, but that night, it felt different. Heavy in a way I couldn't explain. When I saw the lights of the service station in the distance, it felt like finding an oasis in the desert. I parked my car in front of one of the pumps, got out, and began refueling. The air was cold, and the only sound was the steady click of the fuel filling the tank. I hadn't noticed the figure in the background standing near the illuminated convenience store sign until I felt the weight of his gaze on me. It was a man. He stood on the sidewalk wearing a black hat that cast shadows over his face, even under the fluorescent lights. He didn't move, just stood there watching me, as if studying my every move. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself that he was probably just another traveler waiting for someone or taking a break. After finishing at the pump, I went into the store to grab a coffee and a snack. The space was small, with cramped shelves and a young cashier who seemed more interested in his phone than in the customers. As I browsed for something to eat, a shiver ran down my spine. I glanced toward the door, and there he was, the man in the hat, standing in the corner, pretending to browse the shelves. I tried to act naturally, but the unease was impossible to shake. His movements were slow, almost calculated, and he kept just enough distance to feel unsettling. I grabbed my coffee and went to the register, where the cashier finally looked up from his phone to ring me up. "Quiet night, huh?" I said, trying to make small talk and shake off the tension. "Yeah, too quiet, actually," he replied disinterestedly, but his eyes flicked discreetly toward the man in the hat. I paid quickly and left the store, but as I reached my car, I realized the man had also left. He was standing on the other side of the parking lot, still watching me. The weight of fear started to press down on me. I got into my car and locked the doors, but before starting the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was no longer standing in the same spot. He had vanished. Suddenly, I heard the sound of metal against glass, a faint tapping, but enough to make me freeze. Slowly, I turned my head and saw him. He was standing outside my car, just inches from the passenger side window, his hat still obscuring part of his face. But his smile, that was unmistakable. Without thinking twice, I started the car and sped off as fast as I could. As I raced down the deserted road, I couldn't stop myself from glancing in the rearview mirror, fearing that he might be following me. After a few miles, I began to calm down, convinced that I had left that unnerving figure behind. But the real terror was still to come. Driving down the deserted road, I tried to control my breathing and keep my eyes on the path ahead. The feeling of being watched didn't fade, even after leaving the service station behind. I checked the rearview mirror multiple times, praying not to see anyone following me, but paranoia had already gripped me. My car's headlights illuminated only the asphalt and the trees lining the road. The silence was broken solely by the hum of the engine and the wind whistling against the windows. All I wanted was to get home, lock myself in my room, and forget that disturbing encounter. That's when I noticed something strange on the dashboard. The fuel gauge, which should have been full after refueling, was dropping rapidly. It didn't make sense. Cold sweat dripped down my neck. Had something happened at the station? Had he tampered with my car while I was in the store? The road seemed endless, but in the distance I spotted the faint lights of a rest area. Against my better judgment, I decided to stop. My heart pounded, and the last thing I wanted was to get out of the car, but I couldn't keep driving with the gas disappearing like that. I parked near a flickering streetlight that seemed ready to go out. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out, trying to ignore the fact that I was alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by darkness. I walked to the gas tank, kneeling to check for leaks. While inspecting the car, I heard a noise from the forest beside the rest area. It was the snapping of branches, like someone walking through the trees. I stood up quickly, looking toward the sound, but saw nothing except the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. I got back into the car and shut the door, but before starting the engine, something caught my eye. In the side mirror's reflection, I saw movement. A figure appeared on the road, walking calmly toward me. It was him, the man with the hat. For a few seconds, my body froze as I watched him approach. He wasn't running, just walking, as if he had all the time in the world. His hands were in the pockets of his long coat, and his hat still obscured part of his face, but I could feel the same unsettling smile as before. I started the engine and sped away as fast as I could. The sense of relief didn't last long. After a few minutes on the road, I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw something that made my stomach drop. He was there, sitting in the back seat, hat on his head, and that chilling smile on his face. "You're a good driver," he said in a low, almost soothing voice. I screamed and swerved the car violently, veering off the road and stopping on the shoulder. When I turned around, he was gone. The back seat was empty. My mind was in chaos. Was I imagining things? Had exhaustion and fear pushed me to the point of hallucinating? But that smile, it was unforgettable. I got back on the road, driving carefully, but the dread of him reappearing kept me on edge the entire time. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat on the couch, clutching my phone with the police's number already dialed, just in case. The night dragged on, and I didn't sleep a single second. To this day, I don't know if he was a real threat or a figment of my imagination. But something inside me tells me that wasn't the last time I'd see him. And every time I drive down a deserted road at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, praying that the man with a hat never appears again. Some stories seem to rise from the ground, like roots from an endless field that refuses to stop growing. This is one of them, and no matter how much I try to forget, the sound of the wind rustling through the stalks still echoes in my mind. My name is Ethan, and a year ago I returned to my hometown, a small rural community in Kansas. After a difficult separation and the stress of big city life, spending time tending the farm I'd inherited from my parents seemed like a good idea. It was a peaceful place, surrounded by vast cornfields stretching as far as the eye could see. At first, the routine was almost therapeutic. The smell of the earth, the sound of birds, and the slower pace of rural life helped me find some peace. But things began to change when summer arrived. One night I was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee and gazing at the stars. The quiet of the night was interrupted only by the soft rustling of the corn in the breeze. Then I heard something different, a faint laugh, almost childlike, coming from the field. I stood up, intrigued. Who could be out there at this hour? Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped off the porch and began walking toward the cornfields. As I got closer, the laughter became clearer, accompanied by faint, indistinct whispers. The flashlight illuminated only the narrow path between the towering stalks, but I couldn't see anything beyond the dense vegetation. I called out loudly, "Is someone there?" The sound stopped abruptly, leaving the air even heavier. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, but then something moved to my right. I swung the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing. Just the stalks, swaying gently. I returned to the house with my heart racing, convincing myself it was nothing, perhaps an animal or the wind creating strange sounds. The next morning, as I inspected the field, I noticed something odd. A section of the corn was flattened, as if someone had walked through it, forming a zigzagging path. It wasn't something an animal could do. Stranger still, I found a white handkerchief hanging from one of the stalks, swaying gently. It looked deliberately placed. As the days passed, the noises and laughter became more frequent, always at night, always in the field. I tried to ignore them, but my curiosity eventually got the better of me. One night I grabbed my flashlight, a jacket, and an old machete, determined to investigate. The sky was overcast with no moon or stars to light the way. The sound of the wind through the stalks was louder than ever, almost like a whisper beckoning me into the field. I walked along the same path I'd seen before, the flashlight barely illuminating a few feet ahead. After a few minutes, I saw something in the distance, a small figure standing among the stalks. "Hey, who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting for me. As I got closer, I realized it was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with long, unkempt hair and a white dress that looked old and dirty. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to sound less frightened than I felt. She finally turned to face me. Her face was partially hidden by her hair, but I could see a faint, unsettling smile forming. Before I could say another word, she darted into the corn. Instinctively, I followed, but she was quick, vanishing among the stalks as if she knew every path. I ran for several minutes before realizing I was completely lost. The corn around me seemed to grow taller, closing in like it was swallowing me whole. That's when I heard the laughter again, this time coming from all directions. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. My breathing was ragged and sweat dripped down my face. Then a voice whispered near my ear, "You shouldn't be here." I spun the flashlight around desperately, but there was no one there, just the corn, swaying softly. At that moment, I knew I had to get out as quickly as possible. Not knowing where I was going, I ran blindly through the field, the stalks scratching my face and arms. The laughter continued, growing louder and closer, until I finally saw the lights of the house in the distance. When I reached the safety of the porch, I looked back, expecting to see the girl again. But the field was quiet and still, as if nothing had happened. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, but the sound of the wind in the corn kept me awake. And the worst part? On the porch railing, there was another white handkerchief. I didn't sleep that night. The white handkerchief left on the porch railing felt like a taunt. Something or someone was watching me, and that thought sent my mind spiraling. Even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being unsafe. As I sat in the kitchen, staring out at the field, the corn looked like an army of silent sentinels, guarding a secret I was never meant to uncover. The image of the girl and her unnerving smile haunted my every thought. I knew I needed help. I called Tom, a childhood friend who still lived in town. Tom was a skeptic, the type who always sought logical explanations for everything. When I told him what had been happening, he laughed. "Ethan, your mind's playing tricks on you. Those empty fields can be spooky at night. Want me to come by tonight and help you check it out?" Reluctantly, I agreed. I wasn't sure if he believed me or was just trying to humor me, but having someone there felt better than facing it alone. Tom arrived at dusk, carrying a powerful flashlight and a hunting rifle. "Just in case," he said, with a confident grin. As night fell, we decided to head back into the field. The wind was stronger that evening, and the sound of the rustling corn was almost deafening. We walked side by side, shining our flashlights ahead. At first, everything seemed calm, but then, as if the field knew we were there, the whispers started again. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "Probably just the wind," Tom replied, though he didn't sound as sure as he usually did. A little further in, we stumbled upon another path in the corn, similar to the one I'd seen before. It looked as though someone had deliberately carved it out. We followed the trail, and that's when we heard the laughter. Tom froze, his flashlight trained on the source of the sound. In its beam, something darted quickly through the stalks and vanished. "That was a kid?" he asked, now visibly uneasy. Before I could answer, the laughter came again, this time closer, surrounding us. "There's something wrong here, Ethan. We need to leave. I need to know what's going on." Despite his hesitation, Tom followed as we continued down the path. We eventually came to a small clearing in the middle of the field. In the center stood something that made my blood run cold. A scarecrow. But it wasn't like any scarecrow I'd ever seen. It wore a tattered white dress and had a handkerchief tied around its neck. Its face was a burlap sack, with buttons for eyes and a grotesque red thread smile stitched across it. "This has to be some kind of prank," Tom said, clearly uncomfortable. Before I could reply, we heard the sound of fast footsteps behind us. We swung our flashlights around, but no one was there. "Ethan, we need to leave. Now." I nodded, but before we could move, the laughter returned, this time coming from directly behind the scarecrow. Slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the girl. Her face was hidden beneath her hair, but I'd recognize that white dress anywhere. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly lifted her head, revealing that same distorted smile. Without warning, she broke into a sprint, heading straight for us. Tom fired the rifle, but whether he hit her or not, I couldn't tell. She vanished into the corn again, but the sound of her footsteps and laughter continued to echo all around us. We ran like our lives depended on it, stumbling through the stalks and desperately trying to find our way back to the house. The laughter followed us, growing louder and louder as if the entire field was mocking us. When we finally reached the porch, we were out of breath and on the verge of panic. We slammed the door shut and turned off all the lights, huddling in the dark and trying to calm down. "Ethan, this isn't normal," Tom said, his eyes wide with fear. At that moment, we heard a tapping on the window. It wasn't aggressive, but slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was announcing its presence. Tom shone his flashlight toward the glass, but there was nothing there. Only a white handkerchief tied outside, swaying gently in the wind. The next morning, Tom left quickly, muttering that he'd never set foot on that farm again. I knew he was right. I sold the land and moved to the city as soon as I could. Even now, the sound of wind rustling through cornfields gives me chills. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I swear I still hear that laughter in the distance, as if the field is calling me back. It all began with an unexpected message. "My name is Andrew Peterson, and I'm a real estate agent in Salem, Massachusetts. That day, while organizing documents for a house I had just sold, I received an email titled, 'Proposal for Sale, Property on Salem Hill.' I immediately recognized the address, 42 Hillcrest Road. That house. Everyone in town knew the stories about it. Isolated atop a hill surrounded by twisted trees, the mansion had stood vacant for decades. Some said it belonged to a wealthy heiress who mysteriously vanished. Others claimed the house had a darker past, marred by inexplicable tragedies and macabre activities. The email, however, was straightforward. Apparently, the property had passed into the hands of a distant heir who wanted to sell it quickly. The client seemed to value discretion, mentioning that the house needed an evaluation and some photos for the listing. He offered me a generous commission, and since I was in need of a big deal, I agreed without hesitation. 2 days later, on a gray, damp morning, I drove to Salem Hill. The weather seemed to conspire to make the task even more unpleasant. The road leading to the property was covered in dead leaves and fallen branches. My phone's GPS stopped working, but I already knew I was close. The silhouette of the mansion emerged at the hilltop, imposing and grim, with its dusty windows and partially collapsed roof. I parked my car at the rusted gate and grabbed my camera, flashlight, and notepad. As I walked along the overgrown path, I felt a creeping unease as though I was being watched. I glanced around, but all I saw were motionless trees and the overcast sky. I reached the front door, a heavy structure of dark wood with intricate carvings. The key was exactly where the client said it would be, beneath a stone beside the porch. As I turned the key in the lock, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, chilly interior. Surprisingly, the house was well preserved despite its abandonment. Furniture was draped in white sheets, and a thick layer of dust coated the floors. But there was something strange in the air, a faint metallic scent, like blood mixed with rust. I walked through the main hallway, snapping photos and jotting down details. The walls were adorned with old portraits of people who must have lived there. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. I tried to focus on my work, ignoring the growing sense of unease. Upstairs, I found a large bedroom with a window overlooking the hill. When I drew the curtains, the faint daylight illuminated the room. It was well furnished with a canopy bed, an old armchair, and a desk cluttered with yellowed papers. But what caught my attention was a large oval mirror in one corner of the room. I was adjusting my camera to take a photo when something strange happened. For a brief moment, I saw movement in the mirror's reflection. Something passed quickly behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. My breathing grew heavy, but I tried to calm myself. Perhaps it was just my imagination. Determined to finish the job quickly, I headed to the basement to inspect the house's structure, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave. The basement was even gloomier than the rest of the house. Each step on the wooden stairs creaked, and the air was dense, almost suffocating. I turned on my flashlight, illuminating an old boiler and some dusty boxes. That's when I noticed something carved into the stone wall, a strange symbol, like a circle surrounded by runes. As I examined it, I heard a noise above me, dragging footsteps. Frozen with fear, I stared at the ceiling. I was alone, wasn't I? Who else could be here? I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding. When I reached the main hallway, the front door was wide open. I was certain I had closed it when I entered. I left the house, locking the door behind me. But as I got into my car and glanced back at the mansion, I swear I saw a figure standing at the second-floor window. The same bedroom with the mirror. That night I sent the report to the client, vowing never to return. Yet the figure in the window and the symbols in the basement continued to haunt me. I thought I had left the mansion behind. Little did I know, it hadn't left me. After that restless night, I tried to move on. The report was sent, and Mr. Bellamy, the client, responded with thanks, promising to follow up soon to close the sale. However, even as I tried to return to my routine, something about the mansion on Salem Hill continued to disturb me. In the days that followed, I felt an unshakable unease, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on me. At night, while trying to sleep, I would hear strange noises outside my house. No matter how much I checked the windows, I never saw anything. But the feeling of being watched was constant. One night, as I reviewed some of the photos I had taken at the mansion, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In one of the pictures of the bedroom with the mirror, I spotted a vague silhouette reflected in the glass. It was indistinct, but resembled a tall, slender woman with what appeared to be a veil covering her face. The image was so subtle that at first I thought it was a lens defect or a strange reflection. But when I zoomed in, the details of the veil became clearer. Looking at that figure, something inside me screamed that it wasn't just a coincidence or a technical flaw. Something had followed me from that visit, and I needed answers. The next day, I decided to call Mr. Bellamy to ask more about the property. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail requesting a callback, but I never heard back from him. Something felt deeply wrong. Then I received a letter in my mailbox with no return address. The envelope, made of thick yellowed paper, was handwritten in an old-fashioned script. Inside was a brief message. You opened the door. Now you must close it. 42 Hillcrest Road awaits you. Chills ran through my body. Who had sent this? It was clear that the message referred to the mansion. Despite the growing fear within me, something told me the only way to end this was to go back to the house. That same night, armed with courage, a flashlight, and my old pocket knife, hardly a weapon, but it was all I had, I drove to the hill. The full moon cast a cold, silvery glow over the road. When I arrived at the property, I found the front door ajar. This isn't good, I muttered to myself. Entering the house, the metallic, heavy smell was even stronger. The air was colder, and an eerie vibration seemed to pulse from the walls. The house was exactly as I had left it, but it felt alive in a sinister way, as though it were expecting something. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom with the mirror. My instincts told me the key to everything was there. Entering the room, I noticed the mirror's reflection was brighter than the rest of the room, as if it had its own light. Approaching cautiously, I saw the figure in the mirror clearly. It was the woman from the photo, but this time she was staring directly at me. "Get out of here!" I yelled, gripping the flashlight tightly. The figure didn't move, but her lips began to part slowly, and I heard her voice, though there was no sound in the room. "You should not have come here." Suddenly, I felt the floor vibrate beneath my feet, and the mirror began to crack. An ear-splitting sound filled the room, a mix of screams and shattering glass. I turned to flee, but the door had slammed shut on its own. In the mirror's reflection, I saw not only the woman, but multiple figures emerging from the glass. They were tall, distorted shadows, as if pieces of darkness had taken form. The air grew heavier, and my vision began to dim. With the last bit of strength I had, I ran for the door, slamming my shoulder into it until it gave way. I stumbled into the hallway and down the stairs, nearly falling but not stopping until I was outside the house. As I sprinted toward my car, I heard one final scream erupt from inside the mansion, a mix of agony and rage. Back in the safety of my apartment, I did the only sensible thing. Handed the case off to another agent and stopped answering calls from Mr. Bellamy. A few weeks later, I received one final email from him. It read, "The house is satisfied. Don't worry anymore." I never fully understood what he meant by that, but I didn't need further explanation. Since that day, I've never returned to Salem Hill, and I don't want to know what happened there. I've learned my lesson. Some doors were never meant to be opened.